The most dangerous cup in the house. The room is silent in a way that only courtrooms can be silent. London, 1912, inside the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England. This is where the city sends its most serious cases, and where ordinary citizens sit as a jury, asked to decide something that can never be fully undone. A man stands to hear whether the state believes he has committed the most intimate kind of crime, the murder of a woman who lived under his roof. No masked attacker, no forced entry, no loud violence. Instead, a slow illness, a rented room, and a household ritual so ordinary it feels absurd to call it a weapon. Food and drink, possibly even tea. Because the allegation is that an elderly lodger, Eliza Mary Barrow, did not simply fade with age. She was poisoned with arsenic, a substance so common in Edwardian life that it could hide in plain sight. And that is what makes this case feel like a British Library crime classic brought to life. It sits exactly where fiction and reality collide. Tonight, 3 questions will hang over everything you hear. 1. How do you prove murder when the method looks like illness? 2. If arsenic was everywhere in 1911, how can any court say it was administered deliberately? 3. And why did the man accused of poisoning his lodger seem far more focused on her money than on her death? If you're interested in more global true crime told like a documentary, consider subscribing to EnterTheCrime. Edwardian London, respectability, rent, and easy access. For viewers outside the UK, here's the basic geography. London is the capital of the United Kingdom, located in the southeast of England. Islington is a district in North London. Today it's fashionable in places, but in the early 1900s it was a patchwork of working and lower middle-class streets, where money was tight and appearances mattered. This is the Edwardian era, named after King Edward VII. It is often remembered for its fine clothing and polite manners, but daily life for most people was practical and pressured. There was no modern welfare system. Medical care was limited. Old age could be frightening, especially if you were alone. And in thousands of London houses, a common financial strategy filled the gap. Taking in lodgers. What is a lodger, and why does it matter? A lodger is someone who pays to live in another person's home. Sometimes meals are included. Sometimes the landlord, more accurately, the head of household, controls the cooking, the storage, the keys, and the household routine. It creates an imbalance. The lodger depends on the household for warmth and stability. The household has daily access to the lodger's food and drink. The household often learns the lodger's private habits, worries, and finances. It is a relationship built on trust, but also on vulnerability. And in this case, that vulnerability is the foundation of everything. The victim, Eliza Mary Barrow. Eliza Mary Barrow is an older woman, described in the historical record as a lodger with some savings or income, enough to pay for accommodation, but not enough to be truly powerful in a city like London. In 1911, an elderly woman living alone could easily be treated as invisible. If she becomes ill, people may assume it is natural. If she complains, she may be dismissed. If she wants to move out, she may struggle to find another safe place quickly. Her life intersects with the Seddon household in Barnsbury. The Seddons, Frederick and Margaret. Frederick Henry Seddon presents himself as respectable, serious, moralistic, controlling. Many accounts describe him as the kind of man who wants to be seen as upright, the sort of person whose home should feel safe. His wife, Margaret Seddon, lives in the same household. She will be charged alongside him, and her presence forces an uncomfortable question that will never fully go away. If something happened to Eliza Barrow under that roof, what did the other adults in the house know? And what could they say, truthfully, about meals, medicines, and moments behind closed doors? The period detail that changes everything, Arsenic was not exotic. When modern viewers hear arsenic, they imagine a rare poison carefully acquired by a criminal. In Edwardian Britain, arsenic could be disturbingly ordinary. It appeared in some pesticides, rat poisons, and, depending on product and time, items like flypapers and other household goods. That does not mean anyone could accidentally poison themselves easily. But it does mean that arsenic had two qualities that every poisoner loves. 1. Availability. 2. Plausible deniability. And those two qualities shape both sides of this case, prosecution and defense. The quiet engine, money and control. Now we reach the human hinge point. Over time, Eliza Barrow's finances become intertwined with Frederick Seddon. Different sources describe the specific financial arrangements in slightly different ways: banking, savings, paperwork, and what was promised or understood. But the central allegation is consistent across historical retellings. Seddon positioned himself to control, access, or benefit from Barrow's money. That alone does not prove murder. People argue about money every day without poisoning anyone. But in true crime, money plus vulnerability often predicts the direction of a story. So here is our first open loop. Hold on to it. If Barrow's money mattered to Seddon, what would happen if Barrow became too ill to argue, too weak to travel, too dependent to resist? Because in the summer of 1911, Eliza Barrow is not dead. She is simply living in a rented room, trusting the household routines. And then, quietly, without a single dramatic event, she becomes sick. And once she is sick, the person who controls the kitchen controls the timeline. And that is when everything changes. Because the most important question in this story is not who owned arsenic, it is who controlled the cup. A slow illness inside a closed house. Poison cases can be difficult to tell because they do not always have a cinematic moment. Their tension comes from accumulation, symptoms, decisions, contradictions. So, we will move carefully through the key window. Eliza Barrow's illness and death in September 1911, and what happened immediately after. The ordinary beginnings, the safety of routine. In a lodging arrangement, routine is everything. The day follows patterns. Breakfast served at roughly the same time. Tea prepared in the kitchen. Medicine offered when someone looks unwell. Visitors and post handled by the household. Money discussed quietly, often without outside witnesses. In that world, the weapon does not need to be forced on the victim. It only needs to be folded into routine. In Golden Age crime fiction, the sort of stories that later define the classic British mystery, poison often arrives through domestic habits because it creates a special kind of suspense. The killer does not chase. The killer serves. But the real-life version is not clever. It is cruel. Eliza Barrow becomes ill. In early September 1911, Barrow's health declines. The historical record describes a period of illness that worsens over days. Arsenic poisoning, depending on dose and form, can present with symptoms that resemble many other conditions. It can look like food poisoning, infection, gastric illness, or general decline. That is part of why it is so dangerous. It can hide behind medical uncertainty. The people around Barrow would have seen weakness, distress, inability to eat normally, periods where she seems a little better, then worse again. And inside a household, those observations create choices. Who calls the doctor? Who decides what food or drink to offer? Who speaks for the patient when the patient is exhausted? Pattern interrupt, the caregiver's advantage. Here is a psychological reality that often appears in domestic cases. The more someone helps, the more control they gain. If the household tells neighbors, she's unwell, outsiders back away. If the household says, she's resting, visitors are delayed. If the household says, she doesn't want to see anyone, that may end discussion entirely. And sometimes, in lodging arrangements, the lodger's relatives live far away, or are socially distant, or are treated as inconvenient. We are not saying this is what happened in every moment, but we are explaining why lodging situations can become closed systems. So, as Barrow becomes weaker, the house becomes quieter. And quiet is where poison thrives. A key question: was Barrow seeking help outside the household? Historical accounts raise questions about Barrow's intentions, what she wanted, what she feared, what she understood about her finances. Did she want to move out? Did she want to change arrangements? Did she understand what paperwork had been done? Some of these details are disputed in later summaries. But the broader question matters because it influences motive. A person who controls someone else's money may fear one thing above all: loss of control. And when control is threatened, desperation can escalate. The domestic delivery problem: food, drink, medicine. Let's be careful here. We cannot say with certainty that a single teacup was the delivery method. The case is often remembered culturally as a domestic poisoning that fits the tea table template. But the allegation in a legal sense is arsenic administration, potentially through food, drink, or medicine, during her illness. What we can say is this: in a household, especially one where the victim is sick, there are many plausible routes. A soothing drink, a tonic, medicine prepared at home, food served in small portions, easy to dose, even remedies suggested by household members. In other words, opportunity is not rare. It is constant. And that is why, in domestic poison cases, courts often focus less on the precise cup and more on the overall pattern. Did someone have access? Did they have motive? Did they behave in a way consistent with a plan? The moment that freezes time: death. Eliza Barrow dies on the 13th of September, 1911. In many families, death begins grief and chaos. In some households, death begins administration, paperwork, funeral arrangements, sorting property. And it is here that Frederick Seddon's behavior becomes central to the narrative. Because according to historical reporting, Seddon appears highly focused on Barrow's money and possessions after her death. Again, unpleasant behavior is not the same as murder, but it becomes significant when paired with suspected poisoning. The questions investigators later ask sound simple, but they are devastating. Who paid for the funeral? And how quickly was it arranged? What happened to Barrow's belongings immediately after death? What did Seddon tell others about her finances? Was there urgency around documents? Pattern interrupt, a death that becomes a transaction. In white-collar crimes, investigators often say, follow the money. In domestic poison cases, you often must follow something else: the speed of the transaction. A person who is merely dealing with practical matters may proceed with care and transparency. A person who is trying to secure a benefit may proceed with a different energy: quick, definite, controlling. Barrow is buried. And at first, the death may have seemed like one more private tragedy in a city full of them. But then, someone raises concerns. Maybe a doctor. Maybe a relative. Maybe an official who notices the financial entanglement. The historical record points to growing suspicion, and once suspicion reaches a coroner, the process becomes formal. Because in England, if a death appears unnatural or uncertain, a coroner can order an inquest and, crucially, an examination. And that leads us to the moment that turns a private death into a public case: the exhumation. A body is brought back from the ground not to disturb the dead, but to ask a living question. Was Eliza Barrow's illness natural or manufactured? Early forensics, financial motive, and a defense built on everyone had arsenic. For global viewers, here is the key legal step. A coroner's inquest in England is a public inquiry into the cause of death. It is not the same as a murder trial, but it can trigger a criminal investigation. It often involves medical evidence and witness testimony to determine whether a death was natural, accidental, suicide, or unlawful killing. Step 1. Suspicion hardens into procedure. Once concerns are raised about Eliza Barrow's death, the case shifts from rumor to record. The body is exhumed, a serious and sensitive act. Exhumations usually happen only when authorities believe there is a compelling reason to re-examine a death. This is where the Edwardian era meets with science. Toxicology in 1911, not modern, but not guesswork. It is easy to imagine 1911 as pre-science. That is not accurate. By the early 20th century, forensic toxicology is a known discipline. It lacks speed and modern instrumentation, but arsenic is one of the most historically studied poisons, precisely because it has been used so often. Chemists had established methods, such as the Marsh test and related approaches, for detecting arsenic in tissues. The key limitations are different from today. Tests are slower. Lab standards vary. Contamination and handling are constant concerns. Interpretation depends on expert judgment, and defense lawyers can challenge methods aggressively. But the central idea is clear. If arsenic is present in significant quantity in organs, it can be detected. The finding: arsenic evidence. The forensic examination produces evidence consistent with arsenic poisoning. At this point, the story changes. If you are watching as a viewer, you might think, that's it. Case closed. But in court, it is not that simple, because arsenic can appear in more than one way. This is where the case becomes a battle over interpretation. And this is also where Golden Age poison trick thinking enters the real world. Poisoning cases often hinge not on whether poison exists, but on whether the poison can be connected to a person's intent. Now comes narrative reversal 1, the defense argument that has become legendary. Reversal 1, the flypaper pathway. In historical accounts of this case, a major theme is the claim that arsenic could come from flypaper, adhesive strips used to catch flies. Some products at the time used arsenic compounds. If soaked in water, flypaper could produce a liquid containing arsenic. This matters for two reasons. 1. It suggests a plausible household source of arsenic without a suspicious purchase. 2. It creates a narrative that the victim could have ingested arsenic without being deliberately poisoned, or could have self-administered it. So, the defense does not need to prove an alternative story fully. They only need to create doubt. Arsenic existed in the house. Arsenic could have been ingested accidentally. An elderly, ill woman may have taken remedies. You cannot prove who administered it. And to a jury, this can be persuasive, because it sounds reasonable. But here's what investigators do next. They widen the circle beyond chemistry. They go to motive and behavior, following the money, documents, banks, and a paper trail. Investigators examine Barrow's financial arrangements and Seddon's role in them. This is where you can almost feel the shape of a modern investigation forming, even in 1911. Statements taken, paperwork reviewed, banking details compared, witnesses asked about conversations. A note for global viewers: Edwardian banking was not digital, but it was still documented. Money moved through forms, ledgers, and signatures. And in cases like this, documents become a kind of forensic evidence, showing not blood, but intention. This is also where you can naturally imagine the amount of time spent reading and cross-checking paperwork, something modern viewers will recognize as the real work of investigation. Pattern interrupt: motive is not method, but motive shapes method. A critical tension appears. The prosecution needs a story where Seddon had reason to want Barrow dead. The defense insists that financial disputes do not equal murder. Toxicology says arsenic is there, but it cannot name the hand that delivered it. So, investigators look for what poisoners often cannot hide: their behavior around risk. Do they isolate the victim? Do they control access? Do they manage outsiders? Do they rush benefits after death? Reversal 2. A second suspect, and the problem of who served what. Margaret Seddon is charged alongside Frederick. This is not a minor detail. It changes the entire narrative, because now the court must consider household dynamics. Who cooked? Who served? Who was present during illness? Who had access to Barrow's room? Who spoke to doctors? Who handled Barrow's clothing, her food, her remedies? In a poisoning case, 2 adults in a house can mean 2 possibilities. 1. Conspiracy. 2. Or misdirection. 3. Or an innocent person trapped in another person's plan. This is the kind of human complexity Golden Age novels love. But real trials cannot resolve complexity with cleverness. They resolve it with evidence, and the absence of evidence. Witnesses. The unstable foundation. The investigation relies partly on witnesses, neighbors, doctors, relatives, anyone who saw or heard relevant details. Witness testimony has built-in problems. People misremember timelines. People interpret behavior through bias. In class-conscious London, respectable voices can carry more weight. And after a death, stories change as suspicion spreads. So, investigators try to anchor the case in things less flexible than memory. Toxicology, documents, bank records, purchases and household items, chronology of actions after death. And then the investigation collides with public attention. Reversal 3. The public discovers the fear beneath respectable. Poisoning cases get attention because they attack the core idea of home. Street crime is frightening, but it is outside. Poisoning is frightening because it is inside. Once the press begins describing a lodger, a respectable home, and arsenic, the case becomes a national story. The public begins to ask, if an elderly lodger can be poisoned for money, what does that say about all the small private arrangements happening behind closed doors across London? Now, everything is set for trial. And the trial will become a duel between 2 versions of reality. A version where arsenic is deliberate murder, disguised as illness. A version where arsenic is a tragic accident or self-administration, and a disliked man is being judged for his personality. Because the next question is the one that decides life or death. Can a jury be sure, beyond reasonable doubt, when the method was designed to look ordinary? The respectable mask, the lodger's silence, and why poison cases split juries. In this part, we step back from the timeline and ask, what kind of human environment allows a crime like this to happen, or allows it to be argued about for more than a century? No diagnoses. No mythology. Just documented patterns and human pressures. Why poison is psychologically different. Poison creates a special form of fear because it weaponizes care. In many crimes, the victim recognizes danger. There is a moment where the body and mind say, I am under attack. In poison cases, the victim often believes they are being helped. They accepted tea, soup, tonics, medicine, small comforts. The victim is not only harmed physically, their trust is used as the delivery system. That is why poison is so prevalent in classic fiction. It is the perfect domestic betrayal. But in real life, it is often less clever plot and more exploitation of access. Frederick Seddon, control, order, and moral certainty. Historical portrayals of Frederick Seddon often emphasize a rigid personality, strong moral talk, a controlling approach to household and money. This matters because such traits can function as camouflage. A person who speaks in moral terms can appear safe. A person who values order can appear responsible. A person who is strict can be mistaken for trustworthy. But those same traits can also support a darker possibility, a belief that the world is something to be managed and people are part of the management. In financial exploitation cases, whether murder occurs or not, control often appears as help. I'll handle it for you. You don't need to worry. Sign here. It's simpler. And in a lodging situation, those lines can become a cage. Margaret Seddon, presence, participation, or proximity. Margaret's role is one of the case's most enduring tensions. A jury eventually acquits her, suggesting they did not see proof beyond reasonable doubt that she knowingly participated in murder. But psychologically, the public often struggles with this. How can someone live in the same house and not know? The honest answer is that households vary. Control can be uneven. Power can be concentrated. And in 1911, women often had limited legal and financial agency compared to men, especially in certain social settings. Acquittal does not mean nothing happened. It means the evidence did not prove guilt to the required legal standard. This distinction is essential for a global audience. Legal guilt is not the same as suspicion, and suspicion is not the same as truth. Eliza Barrow. The vulnerability of being not quite family. Eliza Barrow's role as a lodger is crucial. A lodger is close enough to be dependent, but distant enough to be disposable. They may not have advocates nearby. They may not have visitors daily. They may not have someone insisting on hospital care. And if their landlord says, "She's resting," the social norm is often to accept it. This is one reason elder victims appear frequently in domestic exploitation cases across history, not because elders are weak, but because society often fails to protect them when protection requires inconvenience. The investigators and experts, pressure to be certain in an uncertain science. Now we talk about the scientific pressure. Even when arsenic is detected, interpretation can be contested. Was it administered over time or as a single event? Could it come from the environment? What amount indicates poisoning rather than contamination? Were the samples handled properly? In 1911, experts must defend their methods in court, under cross-examination. And prosecutors face a dilemma that exists in many poison trials even today. If you emphasize arsenic is common, you help the defense. If you claim arsenic is rare, you risk being disproved by everyday products. So instead, prosecutors emphasize context. Victims' vulnerability. Defendants' access. Defendants' financial benefit. Behavior after death. In other words, science plus story. The media and the Golden Age mirror. Now the British Library crime classics theme comes into focus. Golden Age fiction, developing strongly in the early 20th century, trained readers to think of poison as a puzzle. A clever method. A neat twist. But real poison cases are not neat. They are morally exhausting. They involve prolonged suffering, uncertain symptoms, arguments over whether a person really meant harm, and families forced to watch private pain become public theater. Media coverage can intensify this by turning a victim's life into a case label. The arsenic lodger, the flypaper defense, the poisoner. Those labels can erase the human being at the center. Eliza Barrow. So here is the key reframing insight, one that changes how we see the entire case. Reframing insight. This case is less about a brilliant poison trick and more about administrative violence. If the prosecution's case is correct, Eliza Barrow was not simply killed. She was managed, through illness, until she could no longer resist, and then her finances could be settled. The violence is not loud. It is procedural. And that is why it frightens people. Because a society can spot loud violence easily. But procedural violence can look like responsibility. Now, pause and put yourself in the jury box. At this stage, what would you decide? Does arsenic evidence plus financial benefit feel like proof? Or does the fact that arsenic could be present in household items leave you uncertain? Comment below what you think, because in the next part, we go into the courtroom where those exact doubts decide a man's fate, because the trial will not only ask did he poison her? It will ask something deeper. How sure can you be when the method was designed to create confusion? The Old Bailey trial, the split verdict, and what modern toxicology could add. We are now at the end point, the 1912 trial and what followed. The Old Bailey, what it is, simply. For global viewers, the Old Bailey is London's main criminal court for serious cases. Trials are held before a judge and jury. The jury's role is to decide on guilt or innocence based on evidence. The judge manages the legal process and sentencing. In 1912, capital punishment exists in England for murder. So, the stakes are absolute. The prosecution's case: arsenic, access, money, and behavior. In broad terms, historical accounts describe the prosecution arguing that 1. Eliza Barrow died with arsenic in her body in a quantity and distribution consistent with poisoning. 2. She was living in the Seddon household, where Frederick Seddon had daily access and opportunity. 3. Seddon had financial motive, benefiting from Barrow's money or positioning himself to do so. 4. After Barrow's death, Seddon's actions with respect to money and possessions appeared suspicious, focused, quick, and controlling. 5. Alternative explanations: accident, self-administration, flypaper scenarios did not adequately fit the overall pattern. The prosecution, in effect, tries to do what all poison prosecutions must do: turn a cloud of could-be into a chain of therefore. The defense: doubt as a strategy, not a story. The defense does not necessarily need to prove that Barrow poisoned herself, or that flypaper definitely caused it. The defense needs to preserve uncertainty. Arsenic exists in household items. Arsenic can be ingested without a murder plot. Symptoms can be consistent with ordinary illness. Financial arrangements can be interpreted in multiple ways. There is no eyewitness to poisoning. This is the psychological reality of poison trials. The method is designed to be arguable. Pattern interrupt. The ordinary details become the battlefield. In violent cases, juries often focus on a weapon or a scene. In this trial, the jury is asked to focus on paperwork, timing, who said what, the credibility of experts, and the logic of household routines. It is the kind of case where small contradictions matter. A statement that changes. A transaction that makes no sense. An explanation that seems too convenient. And then there is the question of Margaret Seddon. The split verdict. Convicted vs. acquitted. The jury ultimately convicts Frederick Henry Seddon of murder. Margaret Seddon is acquitted. This outcome matters historically because it indicates the jury's separated roles. They found the evidence against Frederick strong enough for conviction. They did not find the evidence against Margaret strong enough to remove reasonable doubt. This is not just drama. It is a reminder of how the legal system is designed to work. It is better, in principle, for a possibly guilty person to go free than for an innocent person to be convicted. Whether the system achieved that ideal here is a matter people debate, but that is the principle behind the split. Sentencing and execution. Frederick Seddon is sentenced to death and later executed in 1912. We will not describe the execution in detail. The important reality is this: once carried out, the state's decision cannot be reversed. And that leads to a haunting historical question. If any part of the evidence was misinterpreted, the consequence was irreversible. If the evidence was correct, the consequence was justice for a vulnerable victim. Poison cases force societies to live with uncertainty even after verdicts. Aftermath for Eliza Barrow. The cost beyond the headline. Eliza Barrow becomes known primarily as a lodger in a poison case. But she was a person, elderly, vulnerable, living in a city that did not always protect such people. Her death became a national story because it pierced the illusion of domestic safety. And that is part of her legacy. She forced society to look at what can happen behind respectable doors. Aftermath for the community. The fear of the kitchen. The Seddon case reinforced a cultural fear that appears again and again. You can guard your front door. You cannot easily guard your teacup in someone else's home. It also warned families and lodgers that financial entanglement without legal clarity can be dangerous, especially when one person controls information. What modern toxicology could add is clearly labeled analysis. Now we turn to our documentary's theme, Golden Age Tricks vs. Modern Toxicology. This segment is analysis, not a claim about new evidence, because we are not conducting tests ourselves. But it explains what would be different if a similar case happened today, or if preserved samples were retested under modern standards. Modern forensic toxicology could potentially 1. Quantify arsenic more precisely using advanced instrumentation, for example, techniques like ICP-MS, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. 2. Differentiate forms of arsenic, sometimes allowing experts to discuss whether the source resembles pesticide compounds, medicinal arsenic preparations, or environmental contamination. 3. Analyze hair and nails for arsenic exposure patterns, if preserved, which can indicate chronic exposure over time versus a shorter acute period. 4. Better document chain of custody and sample handling, reducing defense arguments about contamination. 5. Combine toxicology with digital financial evidence, bank records, communications, location history, creating a more complete picture of motive and opportunity. But it is also important to say what modern science still might not do. Even today, toxicology often cannot identify the exact moment the poison was administered or the exact vessel used, unless there is direct evidence, like a contaminated cup, a tainted container, fingerprints, or surveillance. Poison cases can remain circumstantial. So, the central tension of the Seddon case, the battle between chemistry and narrative, still exists in modern courts. Why this case belongs in crime classics history. The Seddon case endures because it contains the ingredients of a classic domestic mystery. A confined setting, a household. A vulnerable victim, a lodger. A suspect with apparent respectability. A common poison with plausible deniability. A dispute over money, and a courtroom where experts argue about invisible evidence. But unlike fiction, there is no satisfying final page. There is a verdict, yes. But the ethical discomfort remains because poisoning crimes exploit the exact habits that make life feel safe. Shared meals, domestic care, a warm cup offered without suspicion. Final reflection. A teacup is not suspicious by design. In the Golden Age imagination, poison in a cup is a clever twist, a puzzle that flatters the reader. In real life, poison in a cup is something else entirely. It is the transformation of trust into a delivery mechanism. Eliza Barrow's case reminds us that modern science can improve detection and modern courts can refine standards, but neither can fully repair what the method destroys first. A victim's certainty that home is safe. The house in Barnsbury was just one address among thousands. The street looked ordinary. The household looked respectable. But the question this case leaves behind is not only who did it. It is the quieter question that lingers after every domestic poisoning trial. If harm can be served as care, how do you ever know which cup is safe? Until it's already too late. Subscribe for more global true crime told like a documentary, and comment, would you have convicted beyond reasonable doubt?